Hello, my name's Sarah Foote. I'm the Professor of Church History in the Faculty of Theology and Religion. Welcome to this virtual open day in Oxford and this taster lecture. I want to talk about one of the central institutions of Western Europe in the Middle Ages and the early modern period, that collection of territories centred on Germany, known as the Holy Roman Empire. In the next 20 minutes, I'm going to look at the origins of that empire, which go back to the very beginning of the 9th century, and ask, what did religion have to do with its making? Although the name Holy Roman Empire comes rather later, its origins go right back to the year 800 and the coronation by the Pope in Rome of a barbarian Frankish king called Charles, later known as Charles the Great, Charlemagne, or Karl der Große. And when the Pope crowned him, he gave him the titles of Emperor and Augustus. Charles was the most powerful ruler in Western Europe in the 7th and 8th centuries and had created the largest single territorial realm that had been known anywhere in the West since the fall of the ancient Roman Empire in the 5th century. In Charlemagne's day, his empire wasn't called holy, but we will see that religion had quite a lot to do with its making. 150 years after Charlemagne, a king of the Saxons called Otto identified himself both as the successor to Charlemagne and to the successor to ancient Rome, and had himself also crowned as emperor in Rome in the year 962, thereby assuming the imperial title for the Saxon royal family. It was only in 1157 that one of his successors, Frederick Barbarossa, first coined the term Holy Roman Empire as a way of showing his authority over Italy and thus by implication over the papacy. By the 16th century, that empire is largely restricted to Germany, when German princes had lost control over Italy and the other wider areas some of their predecessors had ruled. But the institution persists until it's dissolved during the Napoleonic Wars early in the 19th century. Conflicts between church and state are not uncommon throughout the history of the Holy Roman Empire. The relationship between popes who crowned emperors and secular powers could often be fraught. At one particular moment when these came to a head was in the later 11th century, in the time of a great reforming Pope, Gregory VII, who had been a worker in the papal secretariat by the name of Hildebrand. He made a number of changes to the nature of the church and reformed the clergy in his own day, but he was very much opposed to the way in which the emperor and other leading noblemen in his day were taking some responsibility for not just appointing people to hold senior ecclesiastical office in the church, but in his mind the thing that he thought was wrong was that they were also bestowing upon them the symbols of that clerical office. They were vesting them with staff and ring and mitre that would mark them out as bishops. Gregory VII's claims to the particular authority of the Pope as Bishop of Rome were denied by the Emperor Henry IV, and after a long period of controversy between them, in 1076 Gregory excommunicated Henry, cutting himself off from all the rites and sacraments of the Church. This created a major political crisis in Germany. Henry started to lose the support of his nobles and was threatened with the loss of his throne unless he made peace. Peace was brokered between the two rival parties by Matilda of Tuscany, who summoned both of them to her castle at Canossa in northern Italy. Henry came to meet his pope as a supplicant and penitent. He was made to approach the inner part of the castle slowly. Over 3 excruciating and freezing nights he stood outside in the snow, gradually getting closer and closer to the heart of the castle, but only on the 4th day was he finally brought in before the Pope. And this early 12th century image shows him kneeling at the Pope's feet, and you can see that his feet are bare as he's been standing outside in the snow. He did formal penance to the Pope, who accepted him as a penitent and formally received him back into the body of the Church. The eventual resolution of the investiture Controversy involved some compromises on both sides, while the church remained the ultimate right to bestow marks of clerical office on bishops and other leading clergy. Kings retained some powers in their making and naming. That image of a king pleading barefoot in the snow, begging for forgiveness, would prove very powerful in later centuries. This is an event that's about much more than a tussle between two powerful and self-willed men, although one shouldn't perhaps underestimate the strength of personality of both people involved. But what the Pope was trying to do was to establish what he understood to be the right order in the world, to divide the whole world into two realms, a spiritual realm over which he had ultimate responsibility, and a temporal one that was the role of kings. He didn't want kings any longer to be able to interfere in church affairs. And the Emperor Henry IV, rather being honoured, as he might have seen himself as a universal monarch ruling over the whole of Western Europe, had been treated as a mere human being, a creature, a sinner, who had to look to God and God's representative on earth to be brought back within the protective power of the Church. The origins of that empire that Henry IV ruled go back to the time of Charlemagne. Pope Leo III crowned Charles, King of the Franks, King of the Lombards and Prince of the Romans, as Emperor and Augustus in his major church dedicated to St. Peter, the Prince of the Apostles, on Christmas Day in the year 800. These titles, Emperor and Augustus, deliberately evoked those of ancient Roman emperors. Was this just about recognising the political power of the man who was, by a very long way, the most powerful king in Western Europe? Or does it represent in some ways the submission of a secular power to a religious leader, his submission marked by his kneeling in front of the Pope as he puts the crown on his head? The choice of the date to do this on Christmas Day, the first day of the new year of grace 800 years after the birth of Christ, but also, according to some computists at the court of Charlemagne, exactly 6,000 days since God had begun the work of creation. Both contemporary and later commentators presented this event as one marking the inauguration of a new age in the world, a glorious time when church and state were united together in common purpose. But how did we get here? And was the route to this moment in Christmas Day, on Christmas Day in 800, was the route here about politics or about religion? Charles was heir to the kingdom of the Franks, the most successful of the barbarian successor states that had taken over in Western Europe after the fall of Rome. Originally a pagan people, they'd become Christian in the early years of the 6th century. Gradually, the Franks had expanded their territory out of the former Roman Gaul, which is more or less the present-day France, moving both north and east and also south into lands that were occupied by pagan Germanic peoples, especially north and east of the River Rhine, until at the height of his power, Charlemagne was ruling all the areas marked green on this map. This enormous military success was achieved by force of arms, conquering peoples who lived across this extended landmass, many of whom had been pagan before Christian Franks took over their land. Much of the advancement of the Frankish Empire was done by the promotion of Christianity as a means of acculturating foreign people with different cultures into the cultural practices of this Frankish realm. Some of that conversion was done by gentle persuasion and preaching, but some of it, particularly among the Saxons, was done by punitive force of arms, those who refused to conform to the new faith being forcibly put to death. Charles's own ideology and that of those who wrote in his court circle was completely clear. This was a Christian realm. But what was the relationship of the King of the Franks with the Bishop of Rome? In the early Middle Ages, Rome's lands were in a rather unprotected part of central Italy, with a variety of political powers round them, both to the southeast and to the northwest. There were independent dukedoms in southern Italy, which were not necessarily keen to support papal enterprises. Some land in Italy, marked yellow on this map, still belonged to the Eastern Byzantine Empire, with its capital at Constantinople. And at the start of the 8th century, there was another barbarian kingdom which occupied the whole of northern Italy and had very much expansionist pretensions of its own, the kingdom of the Lombards. Conquering the Lombards was one of Charlemagne's early successes. He became king of that territory in the year 774 and thereby became a neighbour of the Papal States. As well as having to cope with enemies to the north and to the south, the potential rivalry of Byzantine forces, there were also threats from pirates and Muslim shipping in the Mediterranean. Rome was in militarily quite a vulnerable position, and the possibility of having a very successful prince to support the lands and power and prestige of the papacy through force of arms was something that would have been very appealing to more than one pope. Leo III, who was pope in the 790s, was not a popular pope in Rome. Many of the people of the city were opposed to him. He had rivals in the papal curia and among some of the leading noble families in Rome. And after a variety of disputes, things came to a head in April of the year 799, when the Pope was on his way to one of the churches in the city to say a service. He was laid upon by a rioting mob, injured, captured, and only some Frankish soldiers who happened to be in the city who were able to rescue him from the mob and carry him away to one of Charlemagne's palaces, ensured that he didn't in fact lose his life on that occasion. Having gone to Charlemagne's palace at Paderborn looking for his protection, Charlemagne offered him that and secured his return to Rome, supported by a Frankish army. There was a trial. He was found innocent of the charges of which he had been accused and put back on the papal throne. But his position remained somewhat vulnerable, and he was in some ways dependent on the support of the Frankish king. One other factor needs to be borne in mind when thinking about the motives for crowning Charlemagne as emperor in Rome, and that was the situation in the Byzantine Empire. After the fall of Rome in the west, the Eastern Empire, based at Constantinople, later known as Byzantium, had persisted, and in the 6th century under Justinian, as this map indicates, the Eastern Empire managed to re-establish some of the lands in the west that had previously been lost, taking control of Italy again. But by 800, those lands in Italy had been lost, and the Byzantine Empire is more focused on the Greek lands and east of there. But Byzantium continued to present some threat in southern Italy and some threat to the interests of the papacy. But Byzantium also had its own political intrigues. The Emperor Constantine VI had succeeded his father when still a child, and his mother had ruled as regent on his behalf until he came to adulthood and started to rule in his own right. Relations between the two of them then seem to have become particularly fraught, and in the year 797, Irene ordered the imperial guard to go and blind the Emperor Constantine in the imperial bedchamber. His eyes were put out and he died in agony a couple of days later, and Irene, his mother, thereafter became emperor alone. She apparently persisted in ruling the empire with great efficiency. She had a large court to assist her in that matter. She'd ruled as regent for many years. There's no suggestion that she didn't know how to run an empire, but of course many of her political neighbours were considerably doubtful and suspicious about the notion of a woman holding the title of emperor in Constantinople, and indeed one Frankish annalist writing in the year 801 explaining how the events of 800 happened started by saying, since the name of emperor was then lacking among the Greeks and they had female rule, something that to him was clearly a complete oxymoron, it looked, at least from a Frankish perspective, as if the Eastern Empire was vacant. Those two events, the deposition of the Pope and his scurrying to Charles for military support to regain his authority, and the removal of the legitimate emperor in the East, created a political vacuum, a vacuum into which Charles could step. He'd earned the right to do so through his military successes against multiple peoples, his massive territorial expansion of the Frankish realm, which had gone hand in hand with conversion to Christianity of the different peoples assimilated inside his empire. One of his leading clerics, Alcuin, could write to him in the year 799 and point out that of the three authorities of supreme standing in the world, the Pope, the Eastern Emperor, and Western military power, only Charles was left standing. Alcuin described him in this letter in overtly Christian terms, saying, "You are the rector, the divinely appointed ruler and governor of all people. It is your role to punish wrong, to correct the errant, to comfort the sorrowing, and to raise up the good." Describing Charles as the secular arm of a Christian state. And this helped to lay the ideological background for the highly choreographed and long-planned coronation that took place in the Church of St. Peter in Rome on Christmas Day. After the third Mass, the great High Mass of Christmas Day, when Charles had been kneeling in front of the altar in prayer, as he stood up to leave the church, the Pope placed a crown on his head, and the crowd acclaimed him Charles, most pious Augustus, crowned by God, the great and peace-giving emperor. To you be life and victory. And after the liturgical praises, he was adored by the Pope in the manner due to the princes of old, and his dignity of patrician being taken away, he was called Emperor and Augustus, as he would then portray himself in his coins and in all the documents of his realm. This was an event that was clearly of mutual benefit to both Pope and Emperor. Being divinely appointed by the Pope, Charles took his responsibilities as ruler and protector of the Christian people over the whole of Western Christendom extremely seriously. But he also, of course, took responsibility for acting as the sword who would protect the undefended papacy against internal and external enemies. So what was religious about the origins of the Holy Roman Empire? It was both a religious and a secular affair. A whole series of secular issues lie behind the imperial coronation of Charlemagne. The deposition of the Pope, the deposition of the legitimate emperor in the East, and the sheer extent of the territory that Charles was ruling. The creation of a Western Empire led to a split between the Western and Eastern churches and a shift in the focus of the papacy towards rulers in the West, first the Carolingians in Francia and later the Ottonians in Saxony. Popes started to take responsibility for king-making and for the crowning of emperors, but kings and emperors assumed reciprocal obligations towards the Church of St. Peter to protect their secular needs. This close relationship between Pope and Emperor helped to create a sense of Christian community over all of the Western Church, a sense that these were peoples, all of whom looked to Rome for spiritual leadership, who saw themselves bound as part of one Christian community, where church and state work together for the good of all. So though highly political in its origins, in many ways, the Frankish Empire was also holy at heart. Do please, if you have any questions, join us for the online question and answer session on the 1st and 2nd of July in the afternoon. Thank you for your time.